Good evening. I'm Michael Kirsty. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Chamber Music of Troy, New York. On behalf of Friends of Chamber Music, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Performance in Context conversation with violin maker Nicholas Frirsz. Nicholas has devoted his life to the art of violin making. A fifth-generation master violin maker, Nick carries on the tradition of the oldest family of luthiers in the world. He began formal studies with his father at a very young age and developed a style while bearing a family resemblance, and applying 4 generations of expertise is clearly his own. Nick, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here tonight.
Amazing. So you come from a long line of luthiers. What drew you to violin making? Was it love at first sight or sound?
Well, I was literally born into this. You have to go back on the timeline a little bit. My parents came from Hungary. We immigrated in 56 when the Russians took over Budapest. So my father had already been through 2 world wars. He was born in 1915, so he lived through World War I, went through World War II, went through the worst inflation in the history of the world in Hungary. And then to top it off, in 56, the Russians decided they were going to ride down Main Street, Hungary. So my father very wisely decided that it's time to leave Europe. So we basically walked across the border in the middle of the night. My mother, my father, and my brother, who was about 9 years old at the time, who unfortunately remembers this whole thing very well. So we were slated to come to the New World, and we made it to Canada. At the time, there was a quota for immigrants into the U.S., so we sat out in Montreal, which is where I was born. So much for family planning, right? Wow. So, we really don't have anything, but we've got 2 mouths and my mother and father. And so basically my dad took a door off the hinges, closet door, made sawhorse legs, and that was his bench.
Wow.
His first bench in the New World. And he'd get some work, and we lived in a little 1-bedroom apartment building in Montreal for about 2 years, and then we got to come to the U.S. And we moved in with another Hungarian family on the west side of New York City, on 91st Street. So we had 7 people and a violin shop in a 1-bedroom apartment on West 91st Street. And so that's what I grew up with. I grew up in the wood shavings. I grew up with the instruments being made. I grew up hearing the Bach chaconne like 10 times a day. I thought that was like our family tune, So I was born into it, and it's something that was always near and dear to me. And I never really thought of doing anything else, honestly. I've never had another job. I've never filed a job application. I've always done this since I was very young. And I'm really so grateful that it all worked out the way it did.
We're all very, very fortunate to have Nicholas Frirsz in the Capital Region area. He's a master violin maker, and he services countless students, professionals around, and it's just always great. I'm a client of yours myself, and I love, his work is just fantastic. How important is mentorship in your family's tradition? Did you work directly under your father? Did you go to school elsewhere?
Well, I worked with my father from a very, very early age. And then at some point in my teens, he said, you need to go back to Hungary and you study with my apprentice, because he had apprentices there himself in Budapest that unfortunately, he had to leave there when we escaped Hungary. So, I mean, we left a lot of family. We left his business. We left his apprentices, his friends. I mean, it's a novella, really. The whole story, how we even got to this country, is amazing. But yeah, mentorship is very important. There's got to be a continuity between the various expertise of each generation. Every generation adds something, a little secret sauce, and it compiles. And there's really one lifetime is not enough to learn everything and understand everything about this profession. It's more of a martial art than a craft.
Without revealing any family secrets, what are some of the most important techniques or skills that have been passed down through your family?
Well, that's kind of a long list. We do construct the instrument different than I think pretty much everybody else. We actually use the instrument as the form. If you look at violin makers, you always see these rib molds and forms and jigs, and my family doesn't use that. My family actually uses the instrument as a jig. And this really opens up a lot of possibilities, because when you're using a rib jig to construct the instrument, basically the silhouette of the instrument has to follow the ribs. And with this technique, the instrument is freeform. So we could actually change the design on the fly if we wanted to. And it enables you to not be locked into one particular pattern. So you can make slight changes to each consecutive instrument if you like. And it really allows a lot of freedom. And it's kind of a detailed technical thing, but that's one of the secrets. So now it's not a secret.
And when you're starting with that figure, do you then draw a sketch of your instruments? Do you use computers to help?
Yeah. No, I always sketch everything out ahead of time, and I also have templates. They're basically templates of the contour. So I've got 150 years of templates that I can draw from, and I can use little modifications. I can start with a basic pattern, change it to suit whatever is needed, either by the player or by the choice of wood, or in the case of viola, the size of the instrument, the string length, the arching, so forth. So it's all about having that flexibility, being able to vary on the fly and really read into what the material needs and what the player needs and what the wood's going to let you do and what the wood's not going to let you do. Because it always has a say in this whole thing. The wood has its own personality. So.
You touch on a lot of topics that I do want to get to, but I'm curious, are there specific tools or materials that you've been using in your family's workshop for generations that you still use today, or do you use new equipment?
I still have basically the original tools. I have tools going back almost 200 years. We really don't use that much as far as tools. It's not a big workshop full of tools. It's basically a good gouge, a good chisel, a couple of good knives, finger planes, which are these little tiny brass planes about that big that you you use to cut the contour of the instrument. And basically, that's all you need. It's not a lot.
So when you're making a violin, how does it differ from the way it was done traditionally by the older makers? Have you changed a lot of the recipe in that, or?
Well, I mean, every violin maker throughout history has their own little variations and little tricks, I guess you would call it. So there are traditional methods for sure, but it's really a question of recipe and what you're trying to achieve at that particular point with the wood and the player.
And so very also curious about the woods you use for your instruments. Do you have a place where you store lots of wood? How do you select the right wood?
Well, wood is also a pretty deep topic. I've been very fortunate that I have old stock wood. When my parents left Hungary, he had a very big complement of ancient instrument wood. Had a big collection of it. And before we scattered to the wind and left Hungary, he took all the supplies and he distributed all of them to different relatives to hide in closets, under beds, under floorboards, wherever. So over the years, as things kind of loosened up in Europe, we'd have a relative come out and they would bring a suitcase full of clothes and they'd bring a suitcase full of wood.
Oh my gosh.
So little by little, over decades actually, we managed to get most of this old growth material out. And that's basically what I've been using. So I'm truly fortunate that I can make a brand new 200-year-old violin because I have wood that is ancient. But as far as sourcing new wood, it's a complicated process. You know, the trees cut in the last 50 years are quite a bit different than trees that were cut 150, 200 years ago.
Is it bigger? Is it wider growth rings or closer growth rings or a difference in densities?
It's the density. It's the nutrient content of the soil has changed over the years, from the virgin forests to forests that have been harvested over time. They all draw out a little more nutrients. So the density changes, the elasticity changes.
And what variety of wood do you typically use? Is it spruce or is it maple or?
Well, traditionally it's spruce for the top and maple for the back and sides and scroll. I really haven't varied much from that. I mean, there are makers that use different combinations of wood, but that's the traditional part that I'm quite happy with not having explored too deeply, because it's a big commitment of time to make an instrument. So if you're going to invest the time and your talent into a piece of wood, you want to start with something that you know is going to give you the best possibility for success.
Right. You know, Paganini remarked that Stradivari only used wood from trees on which nightingales sang. Does it matter if it's an alpine tree or a non-alpine tree, or?
Well, it depends what kind of nightingale. The thing is, even at Strad's time, there were different sources. He didn't source everything from the same place. For 70 years that he made instruments, he didn't get wood from exactly the same place. He didn't get the pigments from exactly the same person. So over time, these materials changed to a degree. So it's basically him adapting to the materials as well. So if you could have exactly the same stuff each time, it would be boring actually, but it's not even possible because wood is different. From one section of a log to another is a totally different story.
Wow. So, and when building a violin, how long does it take from start to finish for an instrument?
As long as it takes, I guess, is the right answer. I mean, time-wise, it could be 3 months, but sometimes there are other things involved. You have to wait, you have to step back. If you're designing something new, you have to let it sink into your mind a little bit. But from start to finish, it would be about 3 months probably.
And do you make violins, violas, cellos, and basses, or maybe one or more of the other? Would you use the same wood on each of those instruments, or would it differ?
Basically the same species of wood, obviously different size. I make violins, violas, cellos. I've done a lot of work with viola, actually. Viola is a very interesting subject because there's no real standard. Violin is pretty well been figured out for the last 400 years. It's really a perfect piece of engineering and basically unchanged for all that time. And I mean, what other technology can you say is unchanged for 400 years?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I mean, peripheral things have changed, obviously. The angle of the neck, the length of the fingerboard, the strings. The bass bar got a little longer, but basically it is perfect.
Wow.
The viola, on the other hand, which is actually, I just love the sound. Viola is really one of my favorite sounds. Viola, you can have a viola this big, you can have a viola this big, and everything in between. And it's really just in the last maybe 100, 150 years that the viola has become a virtuoso instrument. They're playing things on viola that was never, ever meant to be played on viola. And so as far as something that needed to be adapted, the viola is really the one thing that needed little improvement. And in my eyes, it was a question of the size of the viola in order to make the correct sound, viola sound, and still be able to play it technically. So there's always that kind of paradox to have a big enough viola where you have that real alto sound and still be able to get around it. So in the 70s, I had a client say, I want a big viola, but I want it in a small package. He said, I'm giving this job to you. I think you can do this. So I came up with an asymmetrical viola. And I made a bunch of prototypes out of aircraft plywood just to figure out how to do this, how to make it work, and how to not make it look like it was something that was left out in the sun too long. So that was my big contribution to the viola world.
Wow.
And I have one over there. If you wanted to see it, I could show it to you.
Yeah, why don't we take a look at that?
Want me to grab it?
Yes, absolutely.
Give me 1 second. This might be hard to see on a little screen.
So describe which part you adjusted to make it accommodate the sound you were looking for.
Okay. Well, the airspace, this viola is actually 16/7/8, so it's a pretty big viola. So we have the airspace, but what I did is I took the playing side and I shrunk it down. But I did it aesthetically so that you don't really even notice it. So if I didn't point out that, I don't know what the best angle is here, but if I didn't point this out, you would really not even notice it. But here, this is equivalent to a 16-inch viola.
Okay.
On an almost 17-inch frame with a short string length. So this basically is the virtuoso instrument because you got that big viola sound going, but you can get around it basically
The same way.
like a 16-inch viola.
It's very subtle. The difference is
it's very subtle. That was the whole idea is to keep tradition to not make something so crazy looking that nobody wants to hold it or look at. To maintain that classical shape. And on these, I used a one-piece back, because if you had the center seam going down the back, that would kind of give it away.
Right, right.
So these I made with one-piece backs.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And when you were experimenting with, achieving a certain sound, did you just do it by ear? Did you measure it, or how did you come to a conclusion?
Well, this one, like I said, I spent a lot of time prototyping it just with aircraft plywood, just to get the layout, to be able to make sure that you have the clearance for the bow. Important thing, that the string length was workable on a bigger frame, to make sure that the playing side was not going to interfere with going into the higher positions. So I ended up, this was kind of my bread and butter for a long, long time. And now my apprentice Tommy is making this model. So he's carrying this on. Yeah, Tommy done. So this is one thing that I did. And then shortly after that, people started copying me. So,
oh man. So think of yourself primarily as a physicist, an engineer, a mathematician, or an artist when making these instruments and doing these experiments?
Oh, wow. I don't know. There was a lot of hats. There's definitely a lot of hats. I think all of those things and a lot more. Basically, you're a problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
You're solving all these problems, and it's not just having to do with the alchemy of the instrument or the wood or the design. Sometimes it's the player.
Mm-hmm.
You're working with another human being. This is a very symbiotic relationship.
Right. That brought me to my next question. So you make instruments on commission from musicians, and do they ask you for certain tonal qualities? I want a warm instrument. I want a cool or loud instrument. And how do you work with them?
Well, people when they come to me, they usually already know my style, how my sound works, and what I strive for is the openness of sound and the freedom of sound. So if you're playing and you have to bear down for the piano the same way you bear down for forte, you lose the whole dynamic range of the playing. So with the freedom, to give it maximum freedom, you open up the player as the possibility. You give the player the possibility to create the character of the sound, the timbre. By just moving the bow closer to the bridge, further away, you can change the timbre and it still speaks.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have to force each note, you lose the dynamic, you lose the music.
Right.
And then two people suffer, at least two.
Oh man. So when you finish an instrument on commission and a person first plays it, do they come back to you and say, I'd like a little more of this or a little more of that? And how do you modify it?
Occasionally. I mean, with anything new, it requires a little bit of adjustment. So that's something that I'm always open to. I mean, it's the same with just a regular adjustment. People come to me from all over just for a bridge and post that makes so much difference. So it's always a little bit of give and a little bit of take.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make sure the player is on board with what you're doing, and vice versa. A little give and take, because again, this is a very symbiotic relationship.
Right.
We don't exist without the player, and the player doesn't exist without us.
Right. Right. So I'd like to know a little bit more about your experiments with sound production and your tailpiece, the Frirsz tailpiece. How did this innovation come to be, and how do you experiment?
Well, this is actually a Frirsz tailpiece. This is something I've been working on for about 25 years.
Would you mind if I brought that closer to the computer for them to see?
Sure, I've got a cello one on the bench.
Sure. Hold that. Oh. Beautiful.
I've designed them for violin, viola, and cello. This is the cello version.
So this is the cello tailpiece. I'm going to pass this back off to you. I'll just bring this a little closer. So we can see the differences here that it's hollow kind of in the middle, and it has this unique shape here. Could you tell us a bit more about those two qualities?
Sure. Well, the most obvious to the eye is the asymmetry of the tailpiece itself, which is basically extending the after length of the bottom strings, which in itself does not tell the whole story. The thing that you don't see on this tailpiece is that it actually has an asymmetrical twist in the body itself. And what that does is it's equalizing the pressure, because you've got two forces. You've got the pulling force of the string this way, and you've got the pressure of the string coming down on the bridge. So you've actually got two forces that you're dealing with. And what this does is it compensates for the difference in diameter of string as well as the length of string. And with that asymmetrical twist this way, it's basically equalizing the downward pressure as well. So you've got equalization this way and equalization on the downward pressure. And what that does, it really opens up the instrument. It gives it a chance to really respond. And they've done studies of this. Actually, my apprentice, Tommy Dunn, did a study at university on it, and it's creating overtones that are actually out of the realm of human hearing. So it works, and it's cool looking. So
Right. How long did it take you to arrive at this final design?
25 years. I made these by hand for quite a long time, just experimenting, making them for various parties that were interested in this, and then finally, at some point, we decided to bring it to the next level, and we started casting them out of an aircraft alloy. So this isn't actually wood. This is an alloy, aircraft grade alloy, and it's investment cast like a piece of jewelry. And I redesigned the fine tuners as well, so that these are all modular. So at some point, everything mechanical does wear. So these can just be changed very simply by unplugging the module and plugging in a new one, as well as I've got a keyhole mod for it. So it can be set up by the player to either have one fine tuner, 4 fine tuners, or no fine tuners. So the modules plug in like a standard keyhole as well. So thank you.
Amazing. And so in addition to the tailpiece and the body of the instrument and sourcing the wood, you also have to think about varnish. This is what gives each instrument its striking, beautiful look and reflective surface. Is it purely visual, or does it play a role in sound production or increase the longevity of the instrument?
Well, actually, all of those things. Varnish is a long topic too, but I mean, cosmetic, obviously, as far as protecting longevity of the instrument, yes. How you apply it and what you're applying obviously matter. The thickness of the varnish, the elasticity of it. The way I've been taught to varnish is basically more of a painting, so that you get that 3-dimensional effect in the varnish instead of just a flat kind of look.
Right.
So it's like the old story, the Violin, very famous violin maker, great copyist, beautiful varnish. Some violin maker went to him and said, "You have to sell me your varnish. It's so beautiful." So I said, "Okay." So gave him a bottle of varnish, and the guy goes home, puts it on his instrument. It looks terrible. What is this? You gave me the wrong varnish. No, it's the right varnish. It's how you put it on. So it's yeah, you treat it like a painting.
Right. Is it multiple layers of varnish?
It's multiple layers, multiple colors, multiple shadings. It's also how the wood decides to take the color in.
Mm-hmm.
Every wood is a little bit different as far as the porosity of the cells and how it draws in the color. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have a real idea of what color you want it to be, and it's just never going to be that color because the wood is not letting it happen. So it's interesting. It's a conversation.
Right.
Violin making is a conversation.
The instrument. How does the varnish affect the sound of the instrument or the way it vibrates?
The varnish definitely can, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely can, and there have been quite a lot of different studies on that. As far as scientifically, the analysis of a particular varnish and how it reacts to various amplitude inputs, but it's still basically instinct.
Instant.
Yeah.
Instant.
Science has some great stuff, but they really haven't built a great instrument.
Right.
So,
and would an unvarnished instrument differ in sound from a varnished one?
Unvarnished does.
Yeah.
What I do actually, which is also a little bit different than most violin makers, is I varnish the plates before I put the instrument together. Mm-hmm. So when I'm tap tuning the plates, I already have the varnish on. So I've never actually heard my instrument without varnish ever, because I varnish them as I go.
Right.
So it's already varnished going together.
Could you tell us a little more about that tap tuning? What is that? Why do you do it?
Well, basically you're hunting for clarity as you're building it, because this is all carved, obviously. So you're working this parabolic shape into the instrument, and as you do, it changes not only the pitch, but where the pitch originates changes. Mm-hmm. So you're basically manipulating that one clear tap tone to where you want it to be, and at a certain clarity. I'm not really fixated on a particular tone, mm-hmm. Frequency. I'm more interested in clarity and where that tap tone is located, where it's coming from. Wow. So it's a conversation. Yeah.
Right. So, maintenance of these fine instruments, how do you deal with the effects of humidity on them? Do you have a humidifier or temperature control for the shop, or do you recommend humidity control for your clients?
Well, wherever you can humidify. Certainly in this part of the country, it's very hard. Mm-hmm. I have humidifiers going all the time. The best thing really is stability. So you come from a really dry climate, don't make your instrument really super wet. Just mm-hmm. give it a chance to stabilize. And if you can keep it somewhat ambient, that's always better than going extreme, which is why I don't recommend dampits. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with dampits.
Yes.
You must be, yeah. Because it's basically a little tiny sponge, and you put it in water, and it's nice and wet for about 20 minutes, mm-hmm. and then it's dry again. So you have this bigger rotation of the ambient humidity changing to a much higher degree than if you just tried to humidify the room. So when people ask me, what can I do for my instrument? Get a little humidifier for the room that you're playing in. That's really the best thing.
That's the best. Yeah. And some musicians use a summer and a winter setup where the climate varies, like for instance here in New York. Could you tell us about these differences and how they affect the instrument?
Sure. Well, the summer and winter basically is the instrument moving in a state of flux. What happens is that in the winter, the instrument dries and shrinks laterally like this. And the neck, which is attached to the button, which is part of the back, actually draws the neck up. Wow. So the angle of the neck actually changes. We're talking a very small degree.
Right.
But it does. The instrument is moving. And that's why your bridge is sometimes low in the winter. Mm-hmm. And then in the summertime, it expands and that process is reversed. So it's pushing the neck down. Now your bridge is high. So for players that are really sensitive to any change in height, a winter summer bridge. I've got some clients that have 5 different bridges for each little increment. So it depends. Some players, it doesn't really bother them at all, and some instruments move more than others. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just it's just a variable, just another variable. It's alive. It's moving.
It's moving. So, in your experience, what distinguishes a fine instrument from an ordinary one in terms of both craftsmanship and sound?
Well, I think there again, it's the player.
The player.
I think the player makes an instrument great. Mm. It's like the old story, a woman goes backstage to meet Mr. Heifetz. And, oh, Mr. Heifetz, your instrument sounds so amazing. And Heifetz picks up the instrument and says, I don't hear anything. I mean, you're a really talented fellow. You can make anything sound very, very good. So it's the player too. Mm-hmm. It's the player too.
Right. Sometimes you hear a violinist say, well, I play a Strad because it feels better in my hands, or once you learn how to play it, it really gives you back more. And does it have to do with a emotional or tactile attachment? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, part of it is probably brand recognition. I don't know. Somehow you always sound better if you're playing the Strad. Doesn't matter who you are. But I mean, we all, as musicians, we all have relationships with our instruments. I mean, sometimes we spend more time with our instruments than we do with our families. Right? So it's part of the family, and it's just more give and take from the player to the instrument, working back and forth, and that's why it's also good to just pick up other people's instruments, play a lot of different instruments, mm-hmm. and it just gives you a better perspective. Yeah. So I think it's always good to try somebody else's, or go to a shop and just play different things and see how you relate to it, and you might grow much more attached to your own instrument, or you might say, there's might be room for improvement. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you'll hear also that, it still has to open up a little bit. It'll age and it will get better. Is this real or is it a myth?
I'm not really fond of that solution. Just wait. Mm-hmm. I think if an instrument doesn't sound well, pretty much right out of the gate, it's going to be a long time. And the instrument's going to can wait around for a couple of 100 years, no problem, but you and I can't. Mm-hmm. So I think they're a little playing in. I think it's really more, again, the player is the solution there. I think it's not so much the instrument that is playing in as the player responding to the adjustment, responding to what he's getting back tactically and acoustically from the instrument. Mm-hmm. So I think playing it in is, I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So a few challenges I was curious about. What causes a wolf tone in an instrument? And could you let our audience know what a wolf tone is?
Wolf tone, yes. Wolf tone is basically two frequencies beating against each other. Very similar to when you're tuning parallels. When the two frequencies are just a little off from each other, you hear the beating in between the notes. That's basically what a wolf is, but it's a little bit more cunning than that, which is why they call it a wolf, I guess. It's basically an over vibration, and there's a tone instinctive in the instrument that is beating against a particular frequency, and usually it's F sharp. It can be in different places, but for cello, for instance, it's usually F sharp, and that's due to that tap tone that we were discussing earlier not being in the right location. Also, it has to do with the bass bar. So there's just two things. There are two frequencies that are rubbing each other the wrong way, and sometimes it's very hard to trace these things out and get them to be in sync. But actually, that's one of the functions of the Frirsz tailpiece, is to adjust that, because it's balancing out those two frequencies. It's basically bringing them more into alignment, so that they focus together. They're not beating against each other. So that's the wolf. But wolf can be hard to chase sometimes.
Yes. At this point, we'd like to open up the conversation. If any viewers here have a question, please add it to the chat, and we will do our best to answer that. In the meantime, I was curious, was there any major turning point in your career where things changed for you?
Well, my father decided to retire early. So we had a shop on 57th Street in New York City. And I was 22 years old. And he said, "I'm leaving. Good luck. See ya. Bye."
Wow.
So I was 22 years old with my own violin shop on 57th Street. So that probably is fairly substantial.
Right.
And then I got married. I had a kid. Moved out of New York City. I was on 57th Street for quite a few years, and then the rents started going kind of crazy. So I was looking for another location, and there was a bow maker by the name of Frank Torres, really super bow maker, who was next door. And we decided we'd open up the shop together and be one stop. We'd have the violin, we had the bows, and we found a place on 7th Avenue. We were going to open it up, and he got a call that some relative in Brazil passed away, left him a 1,000-acre ranch. So he said, "Well, I'm going. Bye." So that's how I ended up leaving New York City. I finally decided I'm done with New York City.
Yeah.
So that's how I got here.
A beautiful shop here. These instruments here, are these all yours?
No, they're not all mine. This one was made by my father in 1947. It's a copy of the Greffel Strad. This is an instrument that he carried out when we fled Hungary. He didn't want to leave this. He made this for himself.
Wow.
So he actually took it all apart to little tiny pieces and put it in a knapsack. And we escaped Hungary with this on his back. Wow. And a few tools. So
that is amazing.
Yeah, it's a real piece of history. Time travelers. That's what these instruments are.
And
truly time capsules.
Right. Are you a musician yourself? Do you test, when you're listening, aside from the tapping, do you play?
Oh yeah, I have to play a little bit. Sure.
And I was curious, are there any particular strings that you use on your instruments? Do you recommend a certain type of string, a certain
It used to
metal?
be a lot easier with strings. There
Mhm.
were just a few choices
Right.
back when I was starting out. Now there's like page after page. So uh, I wouldn't actually endorse any particular string. I don't think it's all relative. What I do recommend is new strings of any kind. It's always better. That's definite improvement right off the bat. If things aren't working out for you, try new strings.
Yes. And I'm just going to go up. I think I see a question coming in, and I have to go a little closer to see it. All right, our first question. How do you balance the richness in viola C string and not to be thin on the A string?
A lot of that is adjustment, bridge and post. Usually, if you can get a good quality C string on a viola, the A string should not be thin. If it is, then there's probably something going on systemically as far as either bridge or post. If you have a good C string, you should end up with a good A string as well.
Mm-hmm.
Also depends what kind of A string you're using. So the balance of strings on viola is actually a little more interesting, crucial, I think,
Mm-hmm.
than perhaps violin.
And have you ever dropped a violin in the process of making one or repairing one?
I have not done that.
All right.
But I had somebody walk out of here. I had just finished. It wasn't a new instrument; it was a repair, and they were so happy. They put their instrument in the case. It was on the showcase there. We're talking, and they're ready to go. They pick up the instrument, not realizing that they didn't latch the case, and they picked it up off the counter, and it fell on the floor, right in front of me. Luckily, there was not any serious damage, but that was like, whew.
Right. Oh my God, my heart jumped just thinking about that. It looks like we have another question coming in now. That is the same question. Okay. And lastly, do you have any apprentices that you work with? You come from such a long line. Can you tell us more how we'll see these traditions carried on?
Well, my latest apprentice, Tommy Dunn, is kind of graduated to his own shop. He's got a place down in Saratoga on Broadway. He's really talented. He's been with me since he was 16 years old. Mom used to drive him here every day. And now he's all grown up and he's doing fantastic work and he's following in the tradition. And I've had other apprentices as well. So they find me. I don't find them. Tommy came to me through a third party. Good friend of mine, Russian violinist. He said, I know this boy Tommy. He's a very smart boy. He wants to make violins. Oh, okay, whatever. So this went on for like months. I said, no, he doesn't want to make violins. Yes, he does. So we brought him out and he started asking really good questions. And he said, yeah, I really want to make violins. Mm-hmm. So, okay. So he's been with me like 11 years.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. So he's the future.
Amazing. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.